cloudy today, so the cloud should capture it.
And then we'll be able to put it up to YouTube for those who weren't able to sign in. So I guess I'm hosting, so bear with me. So, hello everyone. I'm Ann Carter. I'm the Christmas bird count organizer. This is Audubon's count year 125. And I know that's a bit confusing for some, but if you remember that the counts occur around the world from December 14th through to January 5th, you'll note that this count actually finishes globally in the new year, 2025. So it's count 125. Thank you to all of you, the hundreds of enthusiastic participants who continue to support the tradition of this citizen science project, and to the zone captains who organize their area coverage and collect results. Several have been taking that role for many years. And captains, I'll be sending the report links out to you on Sunday morning. They'll also be on the count website under Captain's Resources if you want to go and pick them up there. For those of you who would like to learn how our count became legendary, that's what Birds Canada calls it, and to find out about Geoff's role in that, there is a link to our library on the count website homepage. That link will be included with the results on the website when I get those compiled and uploaded. Feel free to send me some photographs. I always like to include a few with the results, and they can be of habitat or participants, and of course, birds. And remember, a photograph is the best way to document any rare bird that you might be lucky enough to come across. A special shout out to Nature Alberta's Nature Kids program, which is again providing opportunities for families, youth, and new birders to participate on Count Day. They are fully booked for that event. Last year, Nature Alberta managed 56 bush beaters reporting as a single party. They had different leaders, but we counted them all as one party. Thank you to the folks organizing and assisting in that activity, which helps our event be more inclusive. We are very fortunate to have Geoff Holroyd providing us with information tonight. Geoff became a part of the Edmonton count back around 1986, maybe?
83.
83? So thank you, Geoff, for continuing to assist us with the Edmonton count. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Ann, and welcome everyone. Just one small administrative item. There's 3 people that aren't muted, so just to reduce the chances of interference, if Art Hughes, Mike, and Herbert could mute their computers, then any background noise will disappear for us. And I'm just going to change my view and screen share. Okay, so I hope you see the full screen now. And you can see
yes, sorry, slide. Geoff, I muted myself. Yes.
Sorry, yeah, thanks. So as Ann said, the results of what I'm going to show you here are the result of many people that have participated in the Edmonton Christmas bird counts going back over 100 years. So we don't have 100 Christmas bird counts, but the time span is over 100 years. And the first thing I'd like to do is dedicate the talk to Cam and Joy Finley. And those of you that were active with the Christmas bird count in the late 1980s will know that Cam and Joy were instrumental in growing our Christmas bird count to become the legend it is today. When I moved to Edmonton after the first couple of Christmas bird counts, I commented to Cam and Jim Butler and Jim and Barb Beck and said, you know, we had more people participating in the Banff Canmore count than you guys do, Harry, in Edmonton. And the next thing I know, Cam and Joy are organizing 7 a.m. meetings at the River Valley Outdoor Center downtown, organizing the giant Christmas bird count that you're going to hear about multiple times today. And that was all part of Wildlife 87, which was a big celebration of conservation, wildlife conservation in Canada. And Jerry McKeating, who I chatted with a few minutes ago with you, was a regional director at the time and was instrumental in getting the funding for Cam and Joy to put all the big events across Canada, but in particular the Christmas bird count in 1987. So a bit of historical perspective. We have 75 years of Christmas bird count censuses. And during that, we can identify 3, or I actually changed it to 4 eras, and you'll catch a theme here. So from 1906 to 1955, there were fewer than 10 observers, and that was our earliest era. And then 1955 to 69, there were less than 25, more than 10, but less than 25 observers, and that was an early era. And then the middle era was 1970 to 85 with up to 100 observers. And then 86 to the present is the Wildlife 87 era. So I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 Eras Tour. I'm sorry, I'm laughing, of the Edmonton Christmas bird count. So you catch my theme there. And the problem with giving a talk by remote is I'm hoping there's a few of you smiling, if not laughing at that, but I have to sit here in a quiet house and not know what the reaction is. So as Anne talked about, the Christmas bird count started in 1900. Frank Chapman, who was active with the Audubon Society of the time, was disgusted with what was called a side hunt. So on Christmas Day, people, I won't call them hunters, I'll call them people with guns, would go out and shoot birds. The rarer the bird, the more points they got, and then someone would win. And this would happen in multiple places across, I assume across Canada, but certainly in the US. So on Christmas Day 1900, Frank Chapman encouraged people to go out with binoculars or optical equipment at the time and count birds in their neighborhood. And there were a couple that were done in Canada, one in Toronto, one in the Maritimes. There were very few rules at the start, but as the rules developed, it became all the birds you could see in a 15-mile diameter circle on one calendar day in 2 weeks, plus a few days that includes Christmas and New Year's. And that formula stayed over the years. And the number of participants have grown dramatically from that first one in 1900, and the first counts you can see in the upper graph, to over 2,500 counts in 2020, and we're approaching 3,000 counts now. And likewise, the number of participants from only a handful in the early 1900s to over 80,000 participants in 2020 and growing. So the number of people are growing every year, the number of counts, and you'll see that's having an influence on our count, and I'm going to give you some encouragement for the future. So the first count in Edmonton was in 1906 by Sidney Stansell, who's become a legend in our Christmas bird count circles because he did do that. He repeated the count in 07, 09, and then others did it in the post-war years, 38, 45, and 46. And then there's another gap. And then starting in 1955, they've been conducted every year. And this year, 2024, will be our 70th consecutive year. So we're about to do our 76th count, but I'm reviewing the 75 count so far in this talk. I don't know what we're going to see on Sunday. So I'm not a soothsayer. So here's our circle. Hopefully those of you planning to participate have seen the circle with the different zones. So there's structure to doing a bird count in that the idea is people are searching specific parts of the city and not duplicating and not all going to, for example, down to the river and count ducks and don't count anything else. And each of these zones has a zone captain, as Anne alluded to, and quite a few of them are on the call. And I thank the zone captains for coordinating the counters in their zones. And then within the zone, different parties have got different groups, and they're called bush beaters. And then within the zones also, there'll be feeder watchers, who are people that want to stay comfortable at home, or people that do both. You can watch at your feeder for a while and then walk your neighborhood and report the results to your zone captain. And then those all get compiled by the count compiler, who is Anne, who has volunteered to do that for the last few years. So the number of participants in Edmonton was quite small, as I alluded to in the description of the different eras of our count, but the big increase happened in 1986 and then peaking in 1987, where we had 1,288 people participate in the count. And you can see then the numbers declined and have been bouncing around between 400 and 600 over the last couple of decades. But we lost that to over 1,200 people. When we were in 1987, I was taking a taxi to the airport, and the driver wanted to know what I did. And I said, oh, I'm a biologist, I study birds. And he almost drove off the road saying, oh, there's a bird count coming up. It's a big deal. I hope you're going on the bird count. Here's this taxi driver telling me all about the upcoming Christmas bird count. That's the kind of media coverage we had in 1987. It really was the talk of the town. There was a contest in the Edmonton Journal, and the first prize was a 2-week trip to New Zealand that Cam Finley arranged. So it really was quite a big deal back then. I don't know that we could ever recreate that or recreate it without Cam's enthusiasm. But I'm hoping in this talk to enthuse some of you to come forward and play a bigger role in helping to continue to grow the Christmas bird count, or at least stop its decline. So in 1987, we set a record at 1,288 participants, and nobody's ever beaten that record. That's still a world record. That's iconic, as Birds Canada says, yep, we can be proud of that. We've continued to have the annual record ever since, so nobody's ever even come close to our numbers. But in recent years, there are people sneaking up in the shadows. So Victoria had 405 people last year compared to our 535. And Portland is number 3 at 349. So they're a little ways behind us, but they're clearly getting keen, seeing the results of getting people interested in watching birds. And Victoria in particular have more bush beaters than we do. They just need more feeder watchers, and they could overtake us. So we need to have more enthusiasm, more people participating, cover the city even better than we do to make sure we don't miss any birds and keep these numbers high and maintain our heads up high as the world record holders in terms of participants. In 1987, we actually had so many people for our potluck supper on the count evening that we rented a big hall in the Lions Center in north central Edmonton. There were several hundred people there for supper. You can see in the top slide, that's Jim Butler doing the count summary. Terry Thorman standing in the bottom slide, reporting. I'm not sure what he was reporting at the moment, but many people that some of you are familiar with that are now not as active as they were in the bird count. Terry's, in fact, moved off to BC to warmer climes, but it was really quite a big deal. So we also can hold our head high that we have 3 world records. So Merlin's, black-billed magpie, and Bohemian waxwing, we have seen more on the years that are indicated there on those count years than anyone else, anywhere else in the world. Now, of course, those species only occur in North America, but it's more prestigious to say they're world records than North American records. But in addition to those 3, we actually hold 5 Canadian records. So with those 3, we actually have a total of 8 Canadian records: boreal owl, downy woodpecker, pileated woodpecker, blue jay, and black-capped chickadees. So we've seen more of those on a Canadian Christmas bird count than any other count since they started in 1900. And so we actually have lots to be proud of. We're not just a frozen city in the north with not many birds. We actually hold a lot of records that we can be very proud of. Last year, we held the record, the one-year record for 7 species. So we saw more of these species on our count than anyone else in Canada. Saw-whet owl, boreal owl, downy, magpie, Bohemian waxwing, house finch, and house sparrow. And 2 of those, the Bohemian waxwing and house sparrow, we saw more than any other count in North America. And some of those are pretty remarkable. House sparrows, you think of big cities like Chicago and New York, you think they'd be covered with house sparrows, but maybe they've just got too much asphalt and concrete, I don't know. But we actually saw more house sparrows here than any of the other cities in North America last year. So again, pretty exciting results that our bird count can hold its head high for what we're doing. So the number of birds, so what I'm going to do now is analyze different aspects. You'll see there's a lot of graphs. I can't really apologize for graphs because the bird count is all about results and numbers. And for all of these graphs, along the bottom are the years. The markers, I can't apologize enough for my copy of Excel bouncing those numbers around. It decides randomly what years it's going to show and what it doesn't. But basically, they all start at 06 on the left and end at 2023 on the right. And then the axes, the y-axis varies depending upon what I'm talking about. So in 1986, 87, you can see the number of birds increased dramatically because of the number of participants, the time we put in. So that's something we need to correct for with some species. So as we go through this, you'll see me, or you'll hear me make corrections for the effort that went in to counting birds in different years. So a few questions for you. So over 1 million birds have been counted over the 75 bird counts, 1.3 million. Which species have been seen most often? And I don't have one of those polls where you can push a button and we'll see how many people are right. So you just decide which of those 4 species has been seen most, the highest number totaled over all 75 years. And if you were to say, oh, I didn't do this part, Bohemian waxwing, then you'd be correct. So we've seen 340,000 waxwings accumulate over the 75 years. And so this is the number of species. The number of species that we've seen each year has increased, and there was a bit of a jump in 86, 87, but not a giant jump the way there was in participation. And you can see we actually peaked at 64 species in the early 2000s. And I was ecstatic. We were challenging Calgary, ready to take over the world. And then since then, it's gone down. And you can see in the last few years, we've had a tough time even reaching 50. So that I cannot explain. The climate's getting warmer, the city's bigger. We still have a healthy number of people out counting birds, but somehow our species total has dropped more than 10 species since its peak in the early 2000s. So how many species have been recorded cumulatively? So over all of the bird counts, what's our giant species total? 93, 107, 119, 123. And if you guessed, AI's done this, 119 is the answer. So we've seen 119 species total, but never more than half of those in any one year. And how many species have been recorded at once? Or sorry, only once. I don't know if I can get rid of this. Sorry, I've just got this annoying icon in the middle of my screen that's blocking my view. So how many species are being recorded only once? Okay, and now, so just a sec. Computer glitch going on here. Sorry. So 25 of those, what did I say, 119 species have only been seen once. So we're not likely to see them again, but you never know. They're all possibilities as our climate warms and our city gets bigger. Only one species has been seen on all, sorry, that should be 75 counts. So only one species. So which one species has been seen in all of our counts? And if you said chickadee, you would be correct. So they were there when Sydney Stansell did his count, and we've seen them ever since. You know, the top of my, this is very annoying now, the top of my screen is blanked out, so I can't read the caption on top, so I have to start to guess. So this is the, oh, I think this is the number of party hours. Okay, number of party hours that have been involved, and you can see the increase in effort went up dramatically in 86, 87. The years prior to that, and I remember those are the first three eras of our bird count with fewer than 100 people. They almost barely show on a graph like this. And here's the breakdown of party hours by feeders versus bush beaters. So bush beaters are people that are driving around or out of their car, walking around, walking the river valleys, the ravines, and then feeders are hours people spend at their feeders watching. And you can see although there was an increase in bush beaters in 86, 87, the huge increase was in feeders. And the bulk of the decline of participation, effort, and numbers of people has also been feeders. So we've almost got equal hours now spent bush beaters and feeders. So we need to try and recruit more people with feeders to watch birds, make them more aware of the city and the birds are doing. A side story here was in 86, 87, I was zone captain for zone 2, and Jim and Barb Beck were in my zone. They got really keen on the numbers part of Christmas bird counts, and they drove all the back alleys in Petrolia, so south of White Mud and west of Calgary Trail and north of 23rd and up to the river valley. They drove all the back alleys, documenting where there were feeders, on a map what address they were at. Then they went around to all of the front doors, knocked on people's doors, and gave them a flyer and convinced them to count birds in 1987. And so when a zone captain for zone 2, after I'd done my portion of White Mud Ravine, I had 75 feeders to phone and get the results from. So that was a huge contribution to the whole effort. So we need someone else who's got spare time to drive back alleys, look for feeders, recruit feeder watchers for Christmas bird counts, and help to promote the numbers and get more birds counted. And who knows what species we're missing that are hanging out in one backyard that we're not seeing now because of this. So now we're going to look at some of the species results and try and interpret what happened. So I pointed out black-capped chickadees have been seen every year. You can see a huge increase in the total count in 86 and 87 as more people went out looking. And as I just pointed out, more people with feeders were spending hours watching for them. So the black-capped chickadee numbers spiked and they've been high ever since. But that doesn't truly reflect a population increase in 86 to 87. It more reflects the effort that we were putting in to get people to count birds. So we can divide the number of birds seen by the effort. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. This way is to take the field party hours, the bush beaters, and the feeder hours, and I divide it by 10. We don't quite get 10 hours of daylight, but it more closely represents the number of chickadees a person might see if they were out walking from dawn till dusk. And it also, in some of the numbers, it avoids numbers less than 1. So you can see here that if we divide by the effort, the number of chickadees is actually being remarkably stable compared to the total number when we got that dramatic increase. And if you can see my cursor, Sydney Stansell saw a flock of 100 and he was only out for 8 hours. So that gave him a huge number per 10-hour day, but then relatively few in this early era of the bird count, a cycle of more in that middle era where there were up to 10 people counting, a dip in the late 60s, a couple of peaks in the 70s and 80s, a real dip in the late 80s, and then more regular numbers since then, although with a dip starting in the last 5-10 years, there's fewer numbers. So that could mean the number of chickadees are in a low cycle, but there's no indication of a dramatic decline or increase when we look at their numbers by the party effort and feeder hours. So here I'll introduce another character in our Christmas bird count. I've already mentioned Sydney Stansell. In the last year, John Acorn and his students released this report, which is available on the Nature Alberta website. And I'll just briefly give you the background. The detailed background is in John's report. That Sydney Stansell, after he participated here on Christmas bird counts, wrote a manuscript on the birds of Alberta for 1923, submitted it to the Canadian Field Naturalist. It was turned down. And John then, so I wrote up a history of Sydney Stansell up until he left Alberta and then lost track. John persisted and found he'd moved to California, tracked down and built more of a history of Sydney. And then a few years ago was contacted by a friend of the family, and they had received a box of files from Sydney, including this handwritten manuscript of the birds of Alberta from 1923. And John and his students have gone through, done a detailed edit, and produced it for us. And I thank John and colleagues for doing that. And as I said, it's now available on the Nature website, Nature Alberta website. So it's very general in ways, but it also gives us some insight into what birds were in Alberta, not specific to Edmonton, not just the winter, but in Alberta in general, that we would have never known. And one of the points of this presentation, pointing out some of Sydney's records, is how things have changed and why. And that's obviously one of the points of doing the bird count. They're not standard. Some of the early birders, over 100 years ago by early, documented the birds of Canada and said it's done. We now know where all the birds are, as though their distribution was static. And now with all that, with our hindsight, we know that's not true. Things are constantly changing. So in terms of constantly changing, let's have a look at what Edmonton looked like. Here we are in 1871, Fort Edmonton on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River, and look at our majestic forest. It's gone. It was hacked down for the fort, for buildings, for firewood. It was gone. So we were basically, Edmonton was just a sea of grass, where now we've got trees. And the forest received a reprieve starting in 1940 when coal was discovered along the North Saskatchewan River. Coal mines were dug for almost 100 years. I've taken the history out of the slide, and used for home heating, but the trees were still used for lumber construction. So our forests were pretty decimated leading up to Sydney Stansell in 1905 doing their Christmas bird count. There would have been a lot of shrubs, but very few giant forests for birds to live in. So here's the forest we've got now. But if you take a critical look at it, we've got some big trees, but it's not really an old growth forest in any sense. And knowing the background of it being denuded in the 1800s, one can understand this forest is only a little over 100 years old. And hence, it's actually more of a middle-aged forest than an old growth forest. And it gave me a new perspective. And you can see that in places like White Mud Ravine, which does have patches of big trees. But I know when I moved to Edmonton in '83 and started going down White Mud Ravine, there were areas that were obviously old fields. And in the last, 40 years since I've been here, they've now filled in with aspen and willows. And if you take a detailed look, you can start to realize there are areas with no big trees, especially south of White Mud Freeway. So what did that do to some of our birds? Well, let's look at the woodpeckers that are pretty dependent on trees. The downy woodpecker wasn't there in '05, but Sydney found some in '06, and he reports them as a common resident in Alberta, pretty much wherever there were forests. You can see the numbers varied through the years, and I've plotted this divided by effort. So these are not the raw numbers. These are the number of downies per 10 party and field hours. And you can see a couple of dips here in the late '60s, early '70s. There was a real dip. and then another real dip in the late 80s, early 90s. So even with our huge participation in 87 and subsequently, the number of downies per 10 party hours declined, but the number has been increasing ever since. So that could be a function of climate change. It could be a function of more shrubbery in our river valleys and in our suburban areas. A lot of suburban areas are getting older. The trees and shrubs on people's lots are more dense, or just plain the downies are increasing for a variety of other reasons. Hairy woodpeckers have been more stable. Sydney did get one on the first count, and there's been some almost every year since, except for that one gap. You remember the question I asked you earlier, which species has been seen every year? Poor old Harry would have been on that list, but got missed one year, the third count in 09. But otherwise they've been seen every year. And again, a dip here in the late 60s, and the same as the downy, a dip in the 80s and 90s. So I can't say why the dips are correlated, but certainly those two small woodpeckers didn't suffer from an obvious lack of trees. They were able to not only get enough food, but presumably stay in Edmonton through the summer and have habitat trees big enough they can make cavities and live in them. What about the bigger woodpecker? So here's the flicker. The flicker was absent in those early years, in the early era of Sydney Stansell, and the subsequent one, the second era with not a lot of people. There was one year that did stand out with a bunch of flickers seen, but then a big gap. Another low point in flickers in the late 80s, early 90s, even with huge participation. We weren't finding flickers very commonly in this time period, but subsequently the number of flickers has increased. And I can speculate that that's because our trees are getting bigger and bigger. There's more big trees that flickers can build cavities in, nest in, and subsequently stay for the winter. And likewise, the pileated. So the pileated would have really suffered from the lack of big trees. You can see the gap in that early era of Sydney Stansell where there were no pileateds detected, and then years with some small numbers detected, less than one per 10 party hour. Dip here again in the 70s, and likewise in 86, 87, our big year of participation. There's no big year for pileated. They were there, but they weren't common. But now, even with our declining days spent looking for birds, the number of pileateds per party hour has continued to grow. A dip in the last couple of years, but overall pileated are becoming more common. And I again suggest that's because our trees are now getting big enough that pileateds have no problem finding a cavity to nest in and stay for the year. So what else uses the trees and cavities? One of my favorites is saw-whet owl. So good things come to those who wait in their little tree holes, only if they've got a tree hole that's big enough. So that really should be those who wait for the trees to get big enough to have holes. And we, until recently, didn't know a lot about saw-whets, and people speculated that, in fact, saw-whets migrated, didn't stick around. But we found, in fact, some of the saw-whets do in the bottom there. They actually hang around despite the snow and winter in Edmonton. So we've got two measures of saw-whet numbers. One is the number per hour that people go out owling. So owling is where you go out with a playback. In the old days, it used to be a tape recorder. Now, of course, we can do it electronically. Play the spring call of a saw-whet and see if we can get a saw-whet to respond. And they will respond all through the year. As you probably know, we catch a lot of them at the Beaverhill Bird Observatory, and other banders catch them by playing the spring call. In the fall, they come to the mist nets and get caught. In the winter, you can play the call at the edges of the ravines or in the ravines, and if there's owls there, they will respond. And you can see we started doing a lot of that in the late 80s. I had a student, I've just forgotten her name. Sorry. Anyway, we did some playback experiments to determine a protocol, and then Jim and Bard Beck and Chuck and Lisa Priestley and others, especially in Zone 1, where there's a lot of forest, spent a lot of hours out getting saw-whets, and you can see the numbers. And then the last couple of years, And I'm afraid I don't know who was doing this, but take a pat on your back for you for going out in the last 2 years and resurrecting the owl calling. And sure enough, the owls are still there overwintering. We suspect a lot of these are males, that the females are the ones that predominantly migrate, and the males are the ones most likely to stay on territory. And the most precious resource is that cavity in a tree, the woodpecker hole in a big tree that the pileated or the flicker have made for them. And they're able to live there year round, hope that they get lots of mice, and hope that a female finds them in the spring to lay eggs and raise a family. Here's the actual raw number. Oh no, sorry, this is divided then by party hours. So the dividing by owling hours, some saw-whats are found during the day. So this includes all the saw-whats found during the day. And you can see there were some couple seen in the late 70s by bush beaters without doing playback. But again, the numbers declined up until a couple of years ago when folks started resurrecting the owling. This is a note. I ran across this photo. This could well be a saw-whet owl imprint of the feathers on a window as it crashed into a window. So I encourage all of you to have dots on your windows for daytime birds, but even at night, owls will crash into a window attracted by whatever's inside. And this, of course, is a bad time for that. If we've got our windows open, our houses lit up, and there's a Christmas tree inside, the bird could take a liking to that and try to fly up to the window, up to the Christmas tree. And then you've got a fatality on your hand. So I encourage everyone to put dots or some kind of objects on their window for year round. So what other species were missing in the early 1990s, early 1900s, and why? There was Sydney Stansell documents, there was a 20-year period in the late 1890s, early 2000s, when there were no magpies in the Edmonton area. But you can see after that, this is the number per unit of effort. They were very common, more common up until the 86, 87 counts when we had massive participation. So the numbers got divided by more party hours, but the numbers have continued to grow since then. So overall, magpies are doing fine, but a question is, why weren't they there in that initial era when Sydney Stansell was there, at that point there? And likewise, ravens have an even bigger gap. So ravens used to be common on the prairies. They disappeared in the 1880s, 1890s. Sydney saw one on his first count in 06 and then not one since. And it wasn't until the mid 80s that ravens were again common. So those of you that haven't been birding for a long time, it was a big deal when the first ravens turned up on the bird count. Ernie Kite documented the first nest in White Mud Ravine, and there's a lot of excitement about ravens appearing. One of the curious things is that ravens not only appeared in that same time period in the 1980s in Edmonton, they also appeared in Saskatoon, Winnipeg, into Colorado, Wyoming. Ravens were common in the mountains and in the boreal forest, and something in the 1980s caused them to expand their range out back across the Great Plains. And I haven't read a good description or a good explanation as to why this happened. It wasn't a case of them starting in one area of the prairies and spreading out. It's like they burst out of the foothills all the way down to Colorado, and then out of the boreal forest all the way to Winnipeg, and reoccupied the prairies. You can see their numbers here divided by 10 party hours, peaked in around 2013, and then have declined since then, but they're still healthy numbers, as you know, from the bird count. So why was there a big gap, a little gap for ravens, a big gap for, a little gap for magpies, big gap for ravens? And part of that major explanation was the loss of bisons in the 1800s. So ravens and magpies were carrion eaters from the plains bison carcasses left by plains wolf and plains grizzly. So there were roughly 60 million bison that used to live on the prairies. They used to winter, large herds wintered in the Cooking Lake Moraine, the Beaverhills Moraine, Sherwood Park, and east of that, Indigenous people had camps here, and they would hunt them, and the ravens and magpies would benefit from that. And the herds were, the number of bison was decimated. So in 1870, there's only 541 that were documented in captive herds. We now, of course, have more than that, but that link to the ecology of the prairies was lost when there was no food for magpies and ravens. So they actually disappeared. So we can assume the magpies were able to adjust more easily to our towns, and whatever foods and carcasses we left for them, the ravens took a lot longer to readjust to that change in the ecology and the loss of bison. So when you see ravens and crows, be a bit empathetic for them. They've had a tough time over the last 150 years. So if you think sticks and stones, don't throw them at ravens and magpies. I think they're both very smart, and the magpie in particular is incredibly beautiful. You see the iridescence on them. And I might even put in a pitch. I think the magpie should be the bird of Edmonton bird. So join in the contest of the Nature Club if you haven't already voted. So another category are species that were introduced and adapted to our harsh winters. So the first one obviously is the house sparrow. Here's the number, the raw count, and you can see in the first few eras of the bird count, there were less than 2,000, and then once we had mass participation starting in 86, 87, the numbers of house sparrows increased dramatically and have stayed reasonably high, for most time over 4,000 on our count. We can divide by effort. Again, there was that gap in the early years, and they seem to have peaked in the late 60s. There were a couple of counts with large numbers per 10 party hours. And then after that, being amazingly stable, not a lot of variation. So there's often posts on social media about birds and avian flu. Well, house sparrow is one of our common bird feeder birds, and there's no indication that avian flu or any other disease has affected the population in Edmonton, at least based on the numbers at Christmas. Another bird, though, is non-native here, but arrived. There's no mention of rock pigeons in Sydney's accounts of the early birds, and they arrived here in the early 70s, and you can see the numbers per unit effort are quite healthy. They varied and peaked in the early 2000s, and a bit lower now, but there's still lots of pigeons around. So what birds have benefited from urbanization? So an obvious one is Bohemian waxwings. You may or may not know that mountain ash was introduced to the suburbs of Edmonton and other cities after the Second World War. It wasn't very common as a planted ornamental in our urban cities. So after that, you can see on our graph, they were relatively rare until after the Second World War, 55, 56, they became more obvious. And 2005 was when we set the world record at around 35,000 that were seen. They were just everywhere, huge clouds everywhere. And to be honest, there were probably some double counting, because there's no way when different groups of birders are out looking up in the skies that we could tell whether that flock was counted by someone in another zone or not. So there's probably some double counting there, but still there was a huge number. But maybe a bit alarmingly, in recent years, you can see the last 5 or so bars on the graph, there being very few. So hopefully the waxwings have gone somewhere else and aren't just declining as dramatically as this graph shows, but I can't confirm that. The number per party hour shows sort of eruptive behavior, peaks and valleys frequently throughout the bird count time periods, except for the last half a dozen years, as I've said, where we've had relatively few Bohemian waxwings, and that may or may not be a concern. The smaller cousin, the summering waxwing, cedar waxwing, some of them do stay here for the winter. That wasn't very common until about 1970, and again, somewhat eruptive in the numbers seen. I should point out the scales here. The Bohemian waxwing tops out at 1,600 per 10 party hours. The cedar waxwing tops out at 7 per 10 party hours. So cedar waxwings are relatively rare, and everyone's encouraged, if you see a flock of Bohemians, check for the smaller cousin, look under their tails. It's not rude. You just don't want a brown spot under there. Look at their wings and see if they're missing all the ornamental reds and whites that the Bohemian have. Then you've got a cedar waxwing on your hand. Food of or predator of waxwings is a merlin. It's been well documented here and in Saskatoon that the favorite food of merlins in winter are waxwings. And so you can see the number of waxwings, and we set a record in '86, more than anywhere else in North America, 44, I think, no, 41 that we're seeing. And the numbers have declined in recent years, a general declining trend since then, and that could reflect the lowering numbers of waxwings that we've got wintering. So this is a graph, the same data, but divided by effort, shows a bit more stable population, but still a dip in the last few years of less than 0.5 of a merlin per 10 party hours since, well, in the last 5 years. So how does that relate to the waxwings and merlins? So these two graphs, I didn't quite get them properly labeled. So the bottom is the number of merlins, and the vertical on the upper graph is the number of waxwings. And you can see there's definitely a correlation between when there's a lot of waxwings going up the left-hand side, then there's more merlins going to the right. So there's definitely a correlation with wintering waxwings and wintering merlins. The summer diet of merlins is focused on house sparrows and horned larks out in the country, but in the city focused on house sparrows. And you can see wintering house sparrows and wintering merlins, there's no correlation at all. There's no upward trend as the numbers go higher. So it appears that the number of Bohemian waxwings is definitely affecting the number of overwintering merlins. A few other species that were missing in the first years but are common now, red-breasted nuthatch, which is more common in BC than it is to the east. You can see it was missing in the early era of Sydney Stansell, but they're in small numbers up until 1990 or so. Even with our big effort in 86, 87, there weren't huge numbers of them. But since then, the population has been increasing. I don't know if that's climate change, the growth of our city, the forest regeneration that I've already talked about, or the number of feeders, and whether feeder watchers, number of feeders are certainly the number of seed stores, bird stores in Edmonton has grown, and there's quite a healthy number of bird stores. I don't have any figures on seed sales over the decades. That would be interesting to compile and see how that relates to some of these overwintering birds. The other cousin to the red-breasted, the white-breasted nuthatch, which is more of an eastern nuthatch, was slower to arrive in the Edmonton area. It didn't arrive commonly until the late 60s, but again, its numbers have been increasing in recent years. So they appear to be doing quite well in the city, again, for probably the same factors that are benefiting red-breasted nuthatch. A few other quick ones. I won't go through every one in detail. Pine siskins have increased, and although the last few years have decreased. Dark-eyed junco are pretty common some peak years, but there's pretty consistent juncos overwintering at some feeders. And likewise robins. The last couple of years there weren't many, but overall they're benefiting from the fruit-bearing shrubs that we've been planting over the decades. I always chuckle on Alberta birds on social media when people are amazed to see a robin. They thought they'd all left, but clearly there are robins overwintering many years in the Edmonton area as well as elsewhere. Then the crow, they're still overwintering. They weren't in the middle years. Sydney Stansell actually saw a flock of 100 and said they were not a common wintering bird, as would appear to be the case until the mid-'80s. And then they become more consistent, but still not large numbers, less than 2 per 10 party hours. Purple finch has a bit of a story with it. They appeared in the 70s and appeared infrequently, not every year, as you can see. And then you can see there's a gap of about 5 years centered around 2013. And that was something I hope I corrected. There was a time period when a couple of the birders and compilers decided all rosy colored finches had to be house finches and purple finches weren't here. And I remember hearing that comment at one of our Sunday tallies, and I had to pull out this graph. Of course, there weren't the most recent years on it, to point out there had been purple finches here before house finches arrived, and we shouldn't dismiss records of purple finches. We should scrutinize them and make sure that people are aware of the two finches and the confusion in identifying them. So that gap in the early 2010s, I think, is a function of purple finches simply being written off the chart, and there's no way to correct that. I think those records are gone. And then the cousin that causes the confusion is the house finch. House finch were native to the West Coast, California and the lakes, and then taken as cage birds to the East Coast in New York and other cities in the Eastern US. Of course, invariably they escaped or were let loose, and they spread across the continent coming from the East. And they arrived in Edmonton in the early 2000s, and their numbers, as you can see, have grown quite dramatically. We'll see if they flatten out or if they continue to grow in the years ahead. The other note would be people wondered if growing numbers of house finches would decrease the number of house sparrows. But as I showed you earlier, the number of house sparrows has remained relatively constant. So how about raptors? We've talked a lot about raptor food. There's only two kinds of birds, really, aren't there? There's raptors and raptor food. So here's raptors. The sharp-shinned hawk wasn't around at all until about 1970, and then there's been small numbers. This is just the actual numbers. If I divide by effort, we end up talking tiny fractions. So for these birds, we'll just talk about the actual numbers seen. The maximum was 2001, where 7 were seen, but most years there's 1, 2, or 3. So we can pretty much count on a sharp shin to turn up on every count, fingers crossed. Cooper's hawk is maybe not quite as reliable, but they do appear to be around. Of course, we're hoping that people take good looks at these two hawks and identify them properly. Sorry, my throat's getting dry. I'm not used to talking so much. My dog doesn't listen to me if I talk to him, so I don't talk. And goshawks are actually more abundant. This kind of surprised me because I don't see them very often, but they're more regularly seen and seen in larger numbers than the two smaller accipiters that we just looked at. So watch out for these guys. They, of course, are capable of taking bigger prey. They'll go after squirrels, but they'll go after grouse and ducks that we're going to look at in a second. When we look at the number per party hour, it shows a relatively stable number of goshawks averaged out over the years. So the peaks and valleys that we saw in the previous slide to some extent reflect the effort that's gone into it versus the relatively stable number seen per unit of effort. And I think this is the last predator, great horned owls. They were doing quite well up until the early 2000s, and then the number per 10 party hours has declined. And you'll notice I'm only dividing the numbers here by party hours. They're not commonly seen at feeders, so there's no point in dividing by feeder hours. In this case, we just divide by party hours, bush meter hours. They were around in the early 1900s, and Sydney Stansell reports them as a common resident throughout all the forested parts of Alberta. So they're not a new arrival in any way. So large raptor food, the waterfowl. So let's have a look at waterfowl numbers. So here we have to look at the river, and Per Land showed this picture in a talk about the Birkebeiner. So this is a North Saskatchewan river. That top picture is the Varsity Ski Club downhill run, a ski jump, and they actually had a ski jump there. And those black dots are cars on the river. So I just can't imagine that. Imagine, and this might have been in February when the river's more frozen, but imagine encouraging people to drive out onto the river and feeling safe. So clearly something's changed in our river because we just don't get secure ice formation. Likewise, 1942, the bottom picture are a group of people out skiing, taking cross-country ski lessons at the mouth of the White Mark Creek. Something that, again, you wouldn't do now you wouldn't hazard on that ice at all. So climate change has definitely had an influence on river and river ice, and subsequently waterfowl. The other big factor is our sewage treatment plant at Gold Bar, which now maintains open water all winter. So interesting history here. In 1914, there was actually a court order issued to the city of Edmonton to stop dumping raw sewage into the river. And by 1940s, we were still dumping raw and barely treated water sewage into the river. And finally, in 1956, the Gold Bar wastewater treatment plant opened, and then it was expanded in 1981. So those dates, 56 and 81, I've marked on the maps here. So you can see 1956, the bottom left, was the first appearance of waterfowl commonly on the river at all. And then 81 preceded the giant increase in numbers of waterfowl on the river in 88, 89, and 90, and then a subsequent crash, and then another peak, 2004, and I think the other one was 2002, the third highest peak there. So there were big peaks of numbers of waterfowl benefiting from the sewage treatment and the outflow of the Gold Bar Park. So those two peaks are actually two different species. The first one, 1990 peak, were mallard numbers. So there were almost 5,000 mallards overwintering. The mallards would fly out to fields nearby, the grain fields that were harvested, but there wasn't deep snow. And so they were able to feed on those fields and then come back. And by the time the deep snow arrived, they were kind of trapped. Any urge to migrate was lost. There's a graduate student looked at the condition of these mallards and determined by the end of the winter, although most of them had survived, they actually weren't able to fly. They were so weak, they couldn't fly. And by the time they were able to fly, the breeding season was over. So if there's any genetic component to not migrating, to staying here, that explains the sudden crash in their numbers, because obviously they didn't pass on their genes by staying here, being tricked here because of seed, and then getting trapped here by deeper snow. The other peaks were Canada geese, and I don't have a good explanation as to why the geese suddenly stayed here for 2 years in a row. We do know now there's huge numbers, some in Calgary and then in Lethbridge, but we seem to have escaped the huge numbers that were here in 2002 and 2004, and I'm not sure what conditions would cause. So we're looking at 3,000 geese that stayed on the river in 2002. And this is the number of species of ducks on the river increased from the implementation of the sewage treatment plant on the left to around the early 2000s, and then has dropped off a little bit. So a lot of these are other duck species that are only seen in small numbers, but I don't know why there aren't more of them overwintering, even if there's only one or two. So that takes the birders to spend some time scrutinizing between the ducks and the geese to find the unusual birds, the unusual waterfowl, to document them. We've never had a lot of waterfowl. You can see it peaked out at 8 species in the early 2000s. Another predator of ducks, especially when they're getting stuck in the ice, are bald eagles, and their numbers increased roughly parallel to the increase in the numbers of waterfowl. So you can see a peak there in 97, 2002, and then higher numbers starting in 2016. And last year there were 15 seen. So there's some effort made to reduce duplicates. And so the age of eagles and the time of sighting and the direction of flight are documented, and then they're tabulated by the compiler to try and eliminate obvious duplicates. So it's very hard. They're obviously not all marked, but it also makes it hard to analyze because we're no longer talking about the number seen per hour of effort. We've reduced that because we've reduced the duplication. So how about decreases, pieces that haven't done so well over the last century in the Edmonton area? And most of these are over open country species, so ones that require grasslands. So Sydney's Stansell is still our hero for seeing 6 rough-legged hawks in 1906. He still holds the Edmonton record. We can see we've challenged him 4 times by seeing five rough-legged hawks on our count, but we've never matched Sydney's six. So he can rest with a smile on his face. He still holds one record. The numbers seen recently have not been very common. You can see there's a period there from 85 to about 2000 where they were seen roughly every second year. There were good years, but we really haven't had a good year recently. And that's likely, at least in part, because of the growth of our city. Zone 1 and Zone 15 north and south used to hold large areas of fields on, I guess, land designated for development, but not actually developed. And roughlegs would be able to feed in those areas. And we've now paved that over and turned them into subdivisions. So we're not likely to get large numbers of roughlegs back again in the Edmonton area. Another sad story is sharp-tailed grouse. They do require large areas of grassland. They're a grassland species. And the last one seen in the Edmonton area on our bird count was 2001. And this is an indication of the decline of sharp-tailed grouse across Alberta. I think somewhat sadly, I'll editorialize a little bit, they're actually still hunted. The hunting limits have been decreased or eliminated in the Peace Country. There's a group out of Camrose that are concerned and started a sharp-tailed grouse group to study them, but they're definitely in trouble and could be going the way of sage grouse that are virtually gone from Alberta, a species we need to be concerned about beyond the Edmonton bird count. Bird that's still hanging in there, gray partridge, introduced from Europe in 1946. They first turned up on our bird count. You can see there's been some large numbers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but they're still hanging in there in flocks. They can actually continue to exist in industrial areas of the city where there's a lot of waste weed patches, areas that aren't mowed down to lawn. The grouse, the partridge appear to be able to survive. Pheasants were here starting in 1945, and they were mostly the results of releases for hunting. And that occurred into the early 2000s. The last Edmonton record was 2006, and they haven't been seen since in the Edmonton area. And they're not released in the Edmonton area for hunting anymore, so we're not likely to get them back unless somebody manages to nab one from one of the releases and lets it go so we can find it, but that's sort of cheating, so I don't encourage that. Snow buntings, another bird that's suffering in the Edmonton circle from the lack of open fields and grasslands. So you can see very few seen per party hour since the mid-1980s, whereas there were large numbers. Sydney Stansell reports they were a common wintering bird throughout Alberta in his years up till the 1920s. Snowy owls, likewise, they have very little open country to hunt now in the Edmonton circle, and they're not likely to occur in large numbers. They used to be relatively abundant in the 50s and 60s. The third era of the bird count that we've documented. And likewise, short-eared owls. So likewise, they don't have the open country they used to hunt in because of the lack of habitat and prey. So for fun, I wondered in those years when snowy owls and short-eared owls were they common in the same years or for some reason in different years? And it turns out they were abundant in opposite years. So in years when there was a lot of snowy owls, the left eclipse there were virtually no short-eared owls. And when there were very few snowy owls, then there could be few short-eared or a lot of short-eared. But the large numbers of short-eared never occurred in years when there were a lot of snowy owls. So there's a negative relationship between the two, and one could assume the snowy owl is a potential predator on short-eareds. So if a short-eared owl turned up and there was a snowy owl there, it would just keep going. It's not going to stick around. So I thought that was an interesting graph to point out the apparent avoidance of snowy owls by short-eareds. Grouse, the forest species, as we chop down our forest, we're finding fewer and fewer sharp-tailed grouse or rough grouse, and they're harder to find. So if you're bush beating at all, watch for those tracks in the snow. Try and find rough grouse. We're not getting them every year anymore. I know they're out there in the river valleys, but they're in the deeper bush, and you're not likely to get them if you're just staying on the trails. So they're going to be hard to find. They were there in the early years. They were common in Sydney Stansell's years. and subsequently. And starling is an interesting one. So another introduced species introduced to Eastern North America about the time that house sparrows were introduced. The story is that starlings are featured in English writers' books and articles, and early settlers wanted to reproduce those birds. They arrived in the Edmonton area around 1955. They were relatively common in many years, but in recent years they become quite sparse, and we actually didn't get any last year. The year before, I think there's 50 that were recorded. So they're actually becoming quite rare as a wintering bird, and that I can't really explain unless they're more dependent on feedlots and cattle operations for food rather than bird feeders, but they do come to bird feeders, so I'm not quite sure why their numbers have declined over the last 10 to 20 years there. Redpolls, we did lose one species in our count in the last year because hoary redpoll and common redpoll were lumped now as one species. You can see the total numbers there. We had some years in the early 2000s where there were over 2,500 reported. But again, they're an open country species that requires seeds from on the ground from shrublands and grasslands. And again, we've lost most of that habitat. So we will probably still see redpolls popping up in industrial areas and weedy areas, but they're not going to become common again as they used to be. Likewise, you can see the difference here. If I divide by the effort, they were really common up until about 1980 per 10 party feeder hours, and then being relatively rare and intermittent since then as we've paved the Edmonton bird count circle. Likewise, pine grosbeaks, the number per effort here, they were common until the 80s, and now they're relatively rare even with the bird feeders. There just isn't the other habitat to support them through the winter. And evening grosbeaks are even worse situation. They're actually in a decline across North America. It's not obvious why. I haven't read a good paper on explaining the decline of evening grosbeaks, but they've become very hard to find in the Edmonton area since the mid 80s. I know there are some at feeders north of Edmonton and west of Edmonton, but certainly in our area, they're almost gone. White-winged crossbills are very eruptive. The crossbills feed on conifer seeds, spruce cones, and the seeds in spruce cones. So they're dependent on the cone crop. We had a really good crop there in about 1915, and we haven't had a good year since. So maybe soon we will have another good year. Crossbills are a bit frustrating because I've seen people comment a few years ago we had a huge cone crop and the crossbills didn't arrive. Well, the crossbills could have found or would have found cones elsewhere, so they don't have to come into the city. So even if we've got the food, it doesn't mean the birds are going to come here if they've got food elsewhere. Of course, the worry is that the numbers have declined. So one of the reasons for having bird counts across North America is that we can scan the records and make sure that someone got lots of birds like crossbills elsewhere, even if we didn't happen to get them in any given year. And then the less common cousin to the white wing, the red crossbill, we had a huge outbreak of them, or a huge influx of them in 2012, and we've had very few since. So another bird to watch for in the spruce tops. And then there's one species that hasn't changed much. And if anyone has been following, what common bird have I not talked about? And that's a blue jay. So Sydney didn't get them in the first 3 years. It's not clear why they weren't there in the Sydney Stansell era, but they've been seen fairly consistently between 5 and 10 birds per 10 party hours, feeder hours every year since, and no obvious decline. So that to me is an amazingly stable population from year to year and decade to decade. So thanks to all for watching tonight. I thank for the photos, Gerald Romanchuk, who has provided the photos for decades now for the bird count summary. I've stolen some from All About Birds, the City of Edmonton Archives. I thank again Sydney Stansell for his bird records, even if he's not here to hear my thanks, but John Acorn is. And thank you, John, for compiling Sydney's records. And I thank you, the citizen scientists, the thousands of birders and compilers that have put hundreds and thousands of hours into creating the information that's available, not just in Edmonton, but in all almost 3,000 counts across North America for over 100 years. And the inspiration for this Christmas Bird Count Eras Tour, happy birthday to Taylor Swift. I hope you're smiling. So you're all invited back for the next update. It'll be at 7 p.m. December 15th, 2034. So please mark your calendar. I expect to be here with a bit of luck and able to give it. And otherwise, have a great Sunday. Some of you are doing bird counts tomorrow. Elsewhere, I'm going out to Toefield. I know there's a Fort Saskatchewan count, and then the Edmonton count is on Sunday. That will be number 176. So thank you for your interest tonight, and season's greetings to all. And while you're discussing what questions to ask, if there's time, then here's a list of things to do to help bird conservation and wildlife conservation. And a key one is at the bottom, support conservation groups. So one of the things we used to do at the Christmas bird count on the Sunday evening is we'd have a potluck supper and a tally of the results. It was never a formal tally. The compiler still had to get the final numbers in, but it was a fun accumulation of records. We knew if we were going to set new records for Edmonton or even Canadian records by the end of the evening. It was a good social gathering. With the pandemic, we've kind of lost that. And talking to Anne a while ago, what we really are lacking is 1 or 2 or 3 people to put the effort into hosting a potluck supper, booking a facility, and letting us all know where it is, and help setting it up and taking it down afterwards. So there's a lot of ways that you can contribute to birds and bird conservation, but you can also support your local Edmonton Nature Club in all of its efforts to bring us all together and keep us in communication and supporting birds. And with that, I will stop sharing. And I'm not quite talked out, but I'm getting there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. That was great. So it was a good presentation. And thanks, Anne, for getting us started. I had issues getting in. I had to reload my Zoom program all over again, shut down my whole computer and restart. So I see everybody else got back sooner, so that was good. So everybody see it. We do have it recorded, so I will get that over to Nature Alberta, and it'll be out fairly soon, probably to view for anybody who missed any part of it, and for those who weren't able to make it tonight. So lots of great information.